Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. Mr. Terry, as I continue my search for historical knowledge found here on the internet. Alright, today's video comes from our awesome patrons over at Patreon. Now this past week I kind of did a special edition poll. One thing I wanted to do that I haven't done in quite a while is to cover a mini-series. And one of my favorite channels that does that kind of content is Extra History. And I've covered a handful of their series and they've all been really enjoyable for me and I hope for you too. And some of the ones I'd covered were Genghis Khan, Catherine the Great, Admiral Yi, and a few others. But I wanted to kind of get back to that. So what I did this week is put up some of the other series that they've done that I haven't seen yet and let the patrons pick. And what they chose that got the highest percentage was the Inca Empire. Now I'm really excited that this got chosen because I'm very interested in the pre-Columbian Americas and the Inca Empire being one of the great empires of the Americas. So I'm excited to check this out. So I believe this is a 5-part series. So over the next, near future, I will we'll go over these episodes, and this is going to be really informative to me because I feel like some of these series have been some of the most informative ones that I've been able to consume and hopefully add some of my thoughts and things as a history teacher, and hopefully enjoy that too. So if you would like to vote in future polls, you can join our Patreon. Down below there's a link. So the original episode and the original video will be down below, and as well to that channel, which you should definitely do. Extra History is amazing. They do awesome entertaining content in mini series type format. So I definitely recommend not just checking out the original video here, but checking out all of their content. All right, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, episode 1 is titled Out of Thin Air. Let's see what they got.
Lima, 1615. The old man clutches a parcel, fat and square, that he's dragged from one end of a fallen empire to the other. He is a mixed-race Christian, the son of an Inca aristocrat and a former translator for priests, seeking to study and suppress native Andean beliefs.
You're saying, so 1615, so the conquest is the conquest of the Inca Empire and establish of, they call it New Castile, I want to say is what they called the new Spanish Empire in the south, with Lima being its new capital. So that had been done for decades by now. And yeah, you had this pretty quickly created mestizo or mixed class of Spanish that intermarried with locals. And so you got a lot of people of mixed racial identity.
15 years before, he'd had his property confiscated after suing to get his ancestral lands back. Since then, he's wandered the country observing the disappearing Inca life, compiling a chronicle complete with illustrations. It's a history of the Inca, but also a catalog of abuses by
that's
Spanish.
What they're going off of for this.
Spain must reform the government in a way that protects native people and values their culture. He's carried this book, all 1,000 loose pages of it, through harsh terrain and bandit country. That it survived to this point is a minor miracle. And now, he's finally sending it to its intended recipient, the King of Spain. So Guaman Poma de Ayala takes the only copy of his life's work and hands it to a man aboard a ship. No one will see it again for 300 years.
Okay, I've never heard of this text, but that sounds fascinating. And it sounds like it could be a much better source than maybe what will be produced. One of the tragic things that people have talked about is how there's such an incomplete history of these groups like the Inca that doesn't get through the Spanish era because the materials about the history really get filtered through the Spanish, and surviving closer, maybe not even necessarily like pure Inca, pure Aztec, whatever you're talking about in the Western Hemisphere, pure sources coming from the local sources. You don't have a lot of that, so this could be a very useful source, and it's a shame that they're saying that it got forgotten for so long.
When you get off the plane, the first thing you notice is how thin the air is. And as you exit the airport, a man in a poncho offers you a styrofoam cup full of coca leaf tea to help you deal with the Andean altitude. And your hotel has oxygen tanks in the lobby. Cusco sits at nearly 3,400 meters, or 11,200 feet in altitude. When you walk the cobblestone streets, you feel dizzy and have to stop for a breath after a few blocks. And then, you start to notice something strange. Every large Spanish building in the city has been built on a foundation of Incan stone.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, they built right on top of it. It's kind of a shame because a lot of the cool Inca architecture was destroyed, like temples and stuff like that, and the Spanish would just build right on top of it, not like build somewhere else. Same thing happens in Mexico. You know, in a place like Mexico City, which was once Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and they just built right on top of it, which unfortunately didn't preserve a lot of the amazing stuff that was there before. You know, it'd been nice if, you know, they'd built somewhere else.
Because the Spanish didn't build Cusco. They merely built on top of it. It was in fact the Inca who, despite the altitude, built a city here. And not just any city, mind you. A city that ruled the largest indigenous empire to ever exist in the Americas. The Inca Empire.
At least, yeah, by territory. You know, by territory. It stretched a lot further. The Aztec Empire had a larger population, but yeah, as far as territory goes, and that's what made it, another thing that made it so impressive is you look here, it's like the entire coast of the western South America. It's like 3,000 miles. To be able to have an empire connected like that is truly remarkable. A lot of that, I'm sure they'll talk about, goes to their incredible road system and their government structure, which allowed that kind of connectivity.
Spanned 2,500 miles along the Pacific coast of South America, stretching from present-day Colombia to Chile. And it ruled as many as 12 million people. But sheer numbers can't really convey what an impressive feat that was, because the Inca also controlled some of the most varied and harsh terrain.
Yeah, deserts, mountains,
from
jungles.
Snow-capped mountains to the humid Amazonian jungle to the Atacama Desert, parts of which haven't seen rain in nearly 400 years. Walk the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu, a fairly short route you can still follow today, and you'll pass dusty valleys, lush agricultural terraces, alpine tundra, and jungle. The massive Andes themselves create these microenvironments, forcing the moisture out of passing cloud formations, so part of the Inca heartland remain wet, while earth in the other areas stay powder dry.
Yeah, the environmental effect, from what I understand, you know, comes with the Andes Mountains being, again, so tall, but then also not really far from the coast, which gave the western slopes of the Andes in a huge area a really nice, temperate, watered climate. And that's why you don't see as big of the populations like east of the Andes, but on that west side, those slopes, really, really nice from the environmental effect that comes from there.
In fact, many settlements stand at altitudes that are difficult to breathe in for anyone but the Andeans, whose lungs have adapted to absorb more oxygen.
True.
Actually, after building all of these celebratory churches on the foundations of the Incan capital of Cusco, the Spanish moved the capital to Lima, partially because they couldn't handle the altitude.
Makes sense.
But despite the complexity of ruling over and building in such varied environments, the masonry of the Inca Highway cuts through all of them, at times tunneling through solid rock, winding its way through ruins of settlements, fortresses, terraces, and temples. And the Inca built this sophisticated state without iron tools, the wheel, riding or draft animals, money, or a written language.
All just pure human ingenuity and work, which is so incredible. People will, you know, talk about, if they look at it a negative aspect, these people didn't, you know, have the type of technologies that they had in Eurasia. It makes it even more impressive to me that they're able to create what they did. They don't have beasts of burden that can move stuff, and because of that, they don't have wheeled vehicles because they have nothing to, you know, and no animals to try to pull them, and then with no metallurgy, everything's just with pure ingenuity and will and hard work, and it's truly incredible what they were able to do without those luxuries. And a lot of people don't know the Inca didn't have a writing system. You had them in other places in northern, like the Mesoamerican states, but yeah, they didn't have that, which made it, if you go and look at it further, that even makes it even more incredible they had an empire that big, one of the largest, you know, territorial empires ever, without a writing system. And to be able to keep that is, again, another reason why this is so amazing.
However, they did have Quipu, a series of knotted ropes that help them calculate complex equations and remember numbers and dates. But the rest of their culture, their folklore, their religion, and their history was all oral.
Hopefully they get into Quipu more, because it's those strands, and they have knots in them, and they use them as mnemonic devices or ways to do math. And it kind of, I remember in college, it brought up a debate we had, is like, should we consider it writing? You know, Quipu writing? I mean, what does writing have to be? Is it just something to record something? And if that's the case, then you can kind of consider quipu to be a form of writing. But yeah, maybe not in the script that you saw in other parts of the world. But I mean, it's something to record data or, that kind of thing. And that's maybe at its core what writing should really be about.
Comes a bit of a problem when it comes to telling the history of the Inca Empire. Because while the conquest is well documented, we have no sources from before the period of the Spanish conquest. Like the
Because it didn't exist in the first
Cusco,
place.
where Spanish constructions stand on Inca foundations. All of our stories of the empire come to us to one extent or another via their colonizers.
Yeah.
Following the Spanish conquest, dozens of priests, administrators, and former conquistadors set to work interviewing native people in order to capture the empire's oral history. And while these accounts are better than nothing, their usefulness is, mixed at best.
Yeah.
See, after the fall of the Inca Empire, a struggle began over the empire's cultural legacy. Spanish authorities stripped the valuables from shrines, leveled temples, suppressed native religious practices, and confiscated the imperial mummies. And part of that campaign involved collecting and telling the Incas' oral histories. Some of the priests collected these stories in hopes it would assist in conversion.
Yeah, interesting that a lot of the collection of the culture came from some of these priests who at the same time were charged to try to bring in religion to kind of replace local religion. But it was a lot of those same people that tried to restore that. Or sorry, not restore it necessarily, but like capture it or keep the records.
But many
Preserve.
considered the Inca devil worshippers, or wrote specifically to make their rule appear illegitimate, justifying the Spanish conquest.
Yeah.
Conversely, more sympathetic accounts came from conquistadors who married into the Inca elite and had a closer relationship with the culture. But these two can display a major gap in understanding. Even after living in Peru for decades, the Spanish didn't really understand the Inca or any of the other people who lived under the empire's banner.
Remember, if you look at the actual conquest of it, and we'll see what happens, there were so many cultural misunderstandings that happened between the two sides, and that comes from developing cultures on completely different sides of the planet. It'd be like, meeting an alien race from another planet today. There would be so many differences that you wouldn't even realize it. Like, you'd have these things in your own beliefs that you feel are just, like, natural, but they're not, right? They're all constructs of your society that you're in. So if you don't have those cultural interactions, you're going to develop a lot of very different things. And that happened. And a lot of it led to some horrible misunderstandings that led to death and destruction and stuff.
Their ideas about religion, society, and politics were just too different for these chroniclers to capture accurately. For example, the Inca didn't perceive history in a linear fashion. To tell the history of their four-province empire, they wouldn't start at the beginning. They'd tell the history of the most important province, beginning to end, before moving on to the next most important, and so on.
Interesting.
And it's from one of these Spanish accounts
like
that we
thematic.
get the date of the empire's founding.
Not chronological.
But even that is controversial, and may be entirely wrong. The closest we have to a native perspective comes mostly from a generation of mixed-race authors, the sons of marriages between Inca noblewomen and their Spanish conquerors, all Christians who were born after the empire's destruction.
Yeah.
Among them was Blas Fierra, a mixed-race Jesuit, whose pro-Inca views, especially those about native languages being suitable for discussing church doctrine, may have led his order to imprison, then exile him to Spain.
Oh, wow.
Eventually.
What was he saying? Like, hey, let's get the Bible or something translated into the language of the Inca and to maybe even teach in their language and stuff like that. And they're saying no. I mean, some of this is, they're Jesuits, they're devout Catholics, but it's also around this time where you saw back in Europe, Protestants translating the Bible into other languages. But the Spanish are devoutly Catholic are going to stay with, the Latin and stuff like that.
Eventually, he was murdered, and his work burned during an English pirate raid. Only a few excerpts remain from his history, mostly in the work of another half-Inca chronicler, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who wrote extensively on the empire's history. But while Vega's book, Royal Commentaries of the Incas, is considered the first literary masterpiece by a Native American, it has problems as a work of history. Because you see, Vega left Peru as a teenager and published his chronicles 49 years later, meaning his memory of the oral history had likely degraded. Not to mention, he was writing with a specific objective in mind. while Guaman rallied against Spanish
What
abuses,
objective?
and Valera pushed for indigenous language and culture to be seen as equal. Vega portrayed the Inca Empire as a perfect society, one without poverty, where aristocrats, like his family, provided everything a person would need.
They were is a very, very communal society, very government controlled when it comes to property and food. Everything was overseen by the government, and they would assign jobs and regulate the harvests and stuff like that. So maybe that's the perspective he was looking at. It was not like a capitalistic type system.
In fact, it appears that this mode of
Which isn't gonna be
argumentative
around forever
history
or
was
for
a
a long
hallmark
time
of Andean
anyways.
culture. To the Incas, it seems, history was not necessarily about capturing reality in a fully accurate picture, but rather in molding the past to make a specific point. For example, the Spanish found multiple Incan families in Cusco told elaborate but conflicting versions of the same history, each using it to justify their claim to a piece of land. And as a result of these conflicting testimonies, modern historians have come to vastly different conclusions about the empire depending how they read the sources. And because of this,
Yeah, and it's very likely, like what I just told you, it comes from a biased source too. I'm going off of what has been taught to me, but it's always important as somebody learns history that take everything with a grain of salt and always be open to evidence and analyzing sources, right?
Society has been portrayed as everything, from a communist utopia to a totalitarian nightmare. And details of the empire's founding continue to be debated. But the histories, paired with archaeology, do tell us this. In the early 13th century, a line of kings began coalescing around what would become the city of Cusco. Manco Capac, the semi-mythical founder, and as the legends say, one of the first people to walk the earth, established the kingdom of Cusco before turning to stone. Then came his successors, each taking the ruling title of Sapa Inca, each named for their greatness in construction and war. And they each took names that matched their glory, and were also pretty baller if I do say so myself, such as the valorous, generous Inca, the left-handed, the splendid accountant,
I'm left-handed,
the magnanimous, and my personal favorite, he who weeps blood. They built the city and expanded their territory, creating the Inca ways of life and bringing order to a chaotic world. Or perhaps not, because archaeological evidence indicates that many of the things we consider Incan accomplishments, their farming terraces, building style, agricultural products, statecraft roads, and knotted quipu, were actually inherited from previous Andean societies. But regardless of their source, the Inca were about to use these tools on a scale no one had ever seen. Because in Cusco, the Sapa Inca had a son. He was not the oldest, nor the favorite of his father, but he was intelligent, brave, and with a ruthless vision. He had a birth name, but that is not how he would be known. He would be known as the Earthshaker, Pachacuti, first
founder.
emperor of the Inca, and a man who would remake the world in cataclysm.
Yeah, I've heard of him. That's really where
to your patrons, Ahmed Ziad Turk,
that's where a lot of my
and Gerald Spencer Dinan.
knowledge comes from, is with Pachacuti. With Pachacuti is kind of the founder by, I think he defeats like another major tribe and unifies them, and that's kind of really where you can consider them in the realm of imperial, because they're conquering like a foreign tribe and unifying and then administrating over them. So. But yeah, Andean society goes thousands of years back. I mean, you're talking about like the 1500s AD. It goes millennia back. We have evidence of cultures there in the Andean mountains. So all that food and a lot of the stuff that the beliefs, don't start with the Inca. They didn't, this episode's called Out of Thin Air, but that's not truly what the empire wasn't created out of thin air. Okay, so great introduction. Great introduction to see where they kind of set up themselves to make sure people know that sources on the Inca Empire are very disputed, very contrasting with the ones we have, but then the reasons for that. It doesn't help the recording of history that these people didn't have a written system that you could really interpret and translate into, and when it comes to any kind of historical recording. And then the fact of what we know what the Spanish did do with the Inca Empire and to other empires in the Americas, which was to really kind of squash out a lot of the history, the oral history, religious history, to replace it with kind of a new history. So, but it'll be good to see, the different perspectives, and good to, it's always good when they show that, or say that, hey, this is something that was said, but not necessarily, we don't know for sure, but to get those perspectives out there, I think that's really important. And hopefully, more and more archaeology, because that's what so much of this history has to come from if we want to try to balance it out with the Spanish sources, is actually look at the archaeology and see if they're telling similar stories, because where those things intersect gives us a much clearer understanding of history with written sources and then the archaeological sources that go along with it. So great way to jump into this. Great introduction for us, I think, to kind of jump into and kind of use this as a launch pad to the episodes that are coming up. So hopefully you will continue on with me here and go through this short series. But again, I believe there's 5 episodes. So this is number 1. So we got 4 more to go. But hopefully you'll join along with me. Now, the best way to be able to do that is to make sure that you are subbed to my channel and enable those notifications so you know when those videos are going to come up. Another great way to connect to the community is to join our Discord server, and a link is down below too. We got nearly 8,000 people that are there that love history and love talking about it, and you can get more information and things over there. By the way, if you're a gamer, definitely check out my Twitch channel, Mr. Terry History, or my gaming channel on YouTube, Mr. Terry Gaming, where I do some historical games and some non-historical games for fun as well. All right, the original video link again is down below, so make sure you support Extra History by checking out this video once again, giving the view time and all that, but then subbing and checking out their other series. And I promise you, you will not regret it, and you'll find yourself going down a very fun rabbit hole. All right, and with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.